lose 25 or 30% of the farmers in this country if they don't do something. It has to be done, and it's not just here. It's everywhere.
Farmers are making a cry for help before it's too late. Countless farmers gathered to speak to representatives of Arkansas leaders to share the urgency that something needs to be done about the current state of farming.
News from America's heartland. And what we're witnessing is nothing short of a full-blown agricultural crisis. Just this week, the Trump administration announced a $12 billion emergency bailout for farmers. But here's what they're not telling you. That's less than half of what American agriculture has already lost. We're talking about $27 billion in vanished export markets, family farms filing bankruptcy at rates we haven't seen in years.
This is not your ordinary farm crisis. We call it Farmageddon.
And if they don't do something, there's going to be some farmers that ain't going to be around next year.
You think when you voted for President Trump that things were going to cost you more and you were going to lose money?
I never thought I was going to lose this much money, this fast.
How do you feel about your vote for Donald Trump now?
Well, I feel like perhaps I should have considered some other options.
It's more.
The shock did not begin in the halls of Washington or the trading floors of New York. It began in the fields where rows of soybeans and corn stretched to the horizon with no clear destination. What had once been routine shipments across oceans suddenly stalled, not because the crops failed, but because the rules of global trade had shifted overnight. Tariffs imposed by the United States were meant to project strength, yet the first cracks appeared far from any negotiating table. Deep in rural communities that depended on exports to survive, Africa and China did not respond with speeches or threats. They responded with policy. Quiet announcements emerged from Beijing and several African capitals outlining new procurement frameworks, revised import standards, and accelerated regional trade agreements. The language was technical, but the message was unmistakable. Agricultural imports once sourced from the United States would be replaced. Alternatives were ready and partners were waiting. For decades, American farmers had relied on predictable access to foreign markets. Soybeans flowed to China, poultry moved into African markets, and grain exports anchored local economies across the Midwest and the South. The tariff escalation disrupted that rhythm. Contracts were suspended, futures markets wobbled, storage facilities filled faster than expected. In Africa, the moment was interpreted differently. Governments saw an opportunity to reduce vulnerability and expand food sovereignty. Countries that had long balanced between domestic production and imports began coordinating procurement strategies. Regional blocs prioritized intra-African trade, while external sourcing shifted toward partners willing to offer stability without political conditions. China moved swiftly. State buyers redirected purchases to South America and Africa, while investment funds accelerated agricultural projects across the continent. Irrigation systems expanded, storage infrastructure improved, export corridors were modernized. The intention was not temporary substitution, but long-term realignment. American farmers felt the impact almost immediately. Prices dropped as supply outpaced demand. Cooperative boards held emergency meetings. Rural banks tightened credit. The narrative that tariffs would protect domestic producers collided with the reality of global interdependence. Without access to external markets, abundance became a liability. Protests emerged not in major cities, but along highways near grain silos and ports. Farmers organized convoys, holding signs that spoke less about ideology and more about survival. They were not debating trade theory. They were counting losses. Estimates circulated of tens of billions in vanished exports, numbers that translated into foreclosures, layoffs, and uncertainty. Africa's response gained momentum. Countries that had once been fragmented buyers began presenting unified demand. Agricultural imports were negotiated collectively, securing better prices and stable supply. At the same time, domestic producers received renewed support. Subsidies were redirected toward local processing. Food value chains lengthened within the continent. The balance of power subtly shifted. Where African markets had once been treated as guaranteed outlets for surplus, they now operated with strategic intent, import licenses. Favored partners aligned with long-term development goals. Food security was framed not just as availability, but as control. In China, officials emphasized resilience. Trade diversification had been a stated objective for years, but the tariff shock accelerated timelines. Dependence on any single supplier was now viewed as a strategic weakness. By spreading sourcing across continents, China insulated itself from political pressure while deepening ties with emerging partners. Washington responded. With relief packages, financial assistance was announced for farmers, framed as temporary support during negotiations. But many in rural communities recognized the contradiction. Aid checks could not replace lost markets. Storage could not substitute for demand. The sense of being caught in a geopolitical struggle beyond their control intensified resentment. Africa watched closely. The continent had long observed how global powers negotiated trade. With domestic audiences in mind, often at the expense of external partners, this time Africa was not reacting. It was shaping outcomes. By coordinating with China and reinforcing regional trade, African countries demonstrated leverage rarely acknowledged before. New shipping routes gained prominence, ports along the African coast expanded capacity, rail lines linking inland farms to export terminals received fresh investment, agricultural corridors once dismissed as unviable became strategic assets. Food flowed not just outward, but inward, strengthening regional markets. The ripple effects extended beyond agriculture. Manufacturing inputs, logistics services, and financial instruments adapted to the new trade patterns. Insurance premiums shifted, currency agreements were revisited. What began as a tariff dispute evolved into a broader realignment of economic relationships. American agribusiness firms attempted to adapt, some sought new markets. But competition was fierce and margins thin. Others lobbied for exemptions, highlighting the unintended consequences of the tariff regime. The message from the fields was consistent. Trade wars did not feel abstract when livelihoods were on the line. Africa's internal discourse matured. Rather than framing the shift as retaliation, policymakers emphasized autonomy. The goal was not to punish, but to insulate. Food imports would be sourced in ways that supported domestic resilience and diplomatic balance. External pressure would no longer dictate internal priorities. China reinforced the approach with financing. Long-term credit lines supported African agricultural expansion. Technology transfers improved yields. Training programs developed expertise. These initiatives were presented as partnerships, not charity, aligning with Africa's broader push for value creation. The old trade assumptions eroded. The idea that American agricultural dominance was unassailable proved fragile. Markets responded not to history, but to policy. When access became uncertain, buyers moved on. Trust, once broken, was not easily restored. In the United States, the political debate intensified. Urban centers discussed tariffs in terms of national strength. Rural regions measured them in lost contracts. The disconnect widened, fueling a sense that global strategy had overlooked. Local consequence, Africa and China, meanwhile, consolidated gains. What began as a response hardened into a framework. Trade was no longer reactive. It was strategic. Agricultural flows reflected alliances, not habit. The revolt among American farmers was not just economic, it was psychological. They had been told they were protected. Instead, they felt exposed. As exports vanished and storage bins overflowed, a realization set in that global trade was less about power declarations and more about reliability. By the time negotiations resumed, the landscape had changed. Africa had diversified, China had adapted. American farmers were still waiting for markets that no longer felt guaranteed. The tariff shock had passed its peak, but its legacy endured, etched into new trade routes and altered expectations. And beneath the headlines, one lesson echoed across continents: in a connected world, retaliation could become reinvention, and those who adapted fastest would define the future of trade. The second wave of consequences unfolded more quietly, but with deeper reach. After the initial shock to exports and the visible unrest in farming regions of the United States, the real transformation began inside supply chains, financial systems, and political assumptions that had been taken for granted for generations. What looked like a trade dispute was now exposing structural weaknesses that tariffs alone could not fix. In the United States, grain elevators became symbols of excess rather than strength. Mountains of unsold crops strained logistics networks, rail operators reduced schedules, port activity slowed, insurance costs rose as uncertainty replaced predictability. Farmers who had expanded acreage during years of strong export demand now faced shrinking margins and rising debt. Africa, by contrast, experienced a reordering of priorities. Countries that once imported heavily from overseas began coordinating food strategies at the regional level. Agricultural ministries worked with local producers to fill gaps once covered by imports. Regional trade corridors accelerated. Crops grown in one country moved efficiently to neighboring markets, reducing reliance on distant suppliers. China reinforced this shift with deliberate patience rather than rushing to replace American goods. Overnight, long-term contracts were structured with African producers, emphasizing consistency and mutual growth. Storage facilities were expanded, quality standards were harmonized, payment mechanisms were adjusted to reduce currency risk. These measures transformed Africa from an alternative supplier into a strategic partner. The psychological impact on American farmers deepened. Many had believed the disruption would be temporary, a negotiating tactic that would resolve quickly. Instead, they watched as buyers signed multi-year agreements elsewhere. Even when prices dipped low enough to attract interest, trust had eroded. Buyers feared sudden policy reversals and sought stability above all else. Rural communities felt the strain. Equipment dealers saw declining sales. Seasonal labor demand softened. Small towns dependent on agricultural cycles faced declining tax revenues. The ripple effects extended into schools, healthcare access, and local infrastructure. What had begun as a foreign policy decision now reshaped domestic life. Africa's policymakers studied this carefully. They recognized that dependency was not only about imports, but about predictability. By diversifying partners and prioritizing regional resilience, African countries reduced their exposure to external shocks. Food security discussions shifted away from emergency response toward structural control. China's role evolved as well. Rather than acting solely as a buyer, China became an enabler of systems. Investments targeted logistics, research, and processing. The aim was not just to source crops, but to stabilize entire agricultural ecosystems. This approach reduced volatility and aligned with long-term planning horizons. The United States attempted recalibration. Trade envoys engaged in renewed talks. Messaging softened. Exemptions were discussed, yet markets responded cautiously. Once supply chains adapt, reversal is costly. Infrastructure, contracts, and habits had already changed. Africa's confidence grew. The realization that coordinated action could influence global markets reshaped diplomatic posture. Trade negotiations became more assertive. Export policies prioritized domestic value addition. Agricultural surpluses were managed strategically rather than dumped into volatile markets. The concept of leverage was redefined previously. Leverage had been associated with scale and dominance. Now it was linked to coordination and reliability. Africa demonstrated that collective decision-making could offset historical disadvantages. China demonstrated that patience and investment could neutralize short-term shocks. American agribusiness corporations faced hard choices. Some shifted operations abroad, seeking proximity to growth markets. Others diversified product lines. Yet even large firms struggled to navigate the political unpredictability that now surrounded trade policy. The assumption that government decisions would align seamlessly with commercial interests no longer held. Public discourse in the United States became polarized. Urban narratives framed the dispute as necessary toughness. Rural voices emphasized survival. The gap between national rhetoric and local reality widened. Farmers questioned why they bore disproportionate costs of geopolitical strategy. Africa's internal debates matured in parallel. Rather than celebrating disruption elsewhere, policymakers emphasized lessons learned. Over-reliance on any single partner was discouraged. Even with China, the focus remained on diversification, regional integration, and domestic capacity. New agricultural hubs emerged. Processing plants near farming regions added value before export. Packaging, storage, and branding created employment beyond cultivation. These developments strengthened local economies and reduced vulnerability to external price swings. China benefited from stability. By spreading sourcing across regions and partners, it insulated its food supply from political pressure. Price volatility diminished. Planning horizons lengthened. The tariff shock became a catalyst for reforms that had been discussed but delayed. The United States faced a more complex reckoning, rebuilding. Trust required more than policy reversals. Buyers needed assurance that access would remain stable across political cycles. Farmers needed confidence that markets would exist beyond subsidy programs. Time worked against restoration. Each harvest season reinforced new trade patterns. Each investment in African agriculture deepened commitment. The longer the disruption lasted, the harder it became to unwind. Africa's global standing subtly shifted. Trade. Forums began treating African blocs as unified negotiators rather than fragmented markets. Agricultural policy became a pillar of diplomacy. Food exports were framed not only as economic goods, but as strategic assets. The revolt among American farmers evolved. It moved beyond protests toward political pressure. Rural communities demanded reconsideration of trade strategies that placed them on the front line. The narrative of sacrifice for national strength lost resonance. When sacrifices felt one-sided, Africa and China continued refining their alignment. They avoided triumphalism, focusing instead on system building. The lesson was clear: resilience outlasts confrontation. By designing trade relationships around mutual interest rather than coercion, they reduced the risk of future shocks. Global markets adjusted expectations. Price models incorporated political risk more explicitly. Long-term contracts gained value over spot deals. Stability became a premium attribute. Countries that offered it gained influence beyond their traditional economic weight. By the time analysts assessed the full impact, the numbers told only part of the story. Yes, exports had fallen. Yes, losses mounted. But the deeper change lay in mindset. Trade was no longer assumed to be neutral ground. It was recognized as a strategic domain where trust, coordination, and foresight mattered as much as volume. Africa's strike back was not a single moment. It was a process, unfolding through choices made calmly and collectively. China's support amplified those choices. The United States, confronted with unintended consequences, learned that power exercised without patience could accelerate the very shifts it sought to prevent. And as the new trade order settled, one reality stood firm: global agriculture had entered an era where no market could be taken for granted, and those who adapted fastest would define the next chapter of economic influence.